Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Parshat Vayetze. I've pressed the record button and it's live on Facebook, so we have that out the way. So Vayetze, Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder, Jacob's vow. And yes, Jacob's 20 years working for Lavan in his house, first of all for his two wives, and then for a salary of different kinds of sheep. And at the end of the parasha, he runs away from Lavan, and then he encounters angels at the end of the parasha, actually for a second time. So that's also a striking part of the parasha. But that is a basic introduction. Jacob on the run, and just let's understand, Jacob starts before the dream, he's on the run. What does that mean? Last week, we looked at, he took the brachot, he took the blessings from Esau. Esau is really angry, so angry, he wants to kill Jacob. Rebecca says, you better run away, run to Lavan. But Rebecca also has a second plan in mind, and she speaks to her husband, Yitzchak, with a different idea. I couldn't bear it, she says, if Jacob married one of the local Hittite girls. Let him go to my brother's family and let him marry of the daughters of Lavan. And so Yitzchak, Isaac agrees to the idea, and off Jacob goes. But you have to understand, Jacob's lived at home all his life, in his parents' tent or in his own tent, maybe his tents of learning. However, we understand that he's a person that dwells in tents, a fairly spiritual, secluded kind of life. And now he's running away from the home environment out on his own. That is the Jacob that we find in the beginning of this week's parasha. Let's remind ourselves of what it actually says. And here we are. So we're told in the first place, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Harana. Jacob left Beersheva and he went to Haran. I must say there's a very poignant Rashi here. And although it's not to do with the main thing of what we want to say tonight, nonetheless, it carries a quite profound message for us, really. And it's this. Rashi asks the question, why does it tell us what we already know? We already know from the previous parasha, at the end of last week's parasha, that Jacob went to Haran. And now we're told not only that, again, but he left Beersheva. And Rashi says, when a distinguished person lives in a place, he is its honor, he is its glory, he is its pride. And then he leaves that place, and the honor, the pride, and the glory go with him. And I couldn't help thinking how much that applied to Rabbi Sacks, who in his life gave us so much honor because of who he was and the way he spoke and the way he represented us. And he hasn't gone from the place, he's gone from this world. And we are the poorer for it. But let's go back to the story. So, Vayifga b'makom. This is from Chabad.org. I don't always agree with the translation, but just to say, Vayifga b'makom really means he encountered on a place. He didn't arrive in the sense that he had a planned route. No, he encountered upon the place. Vayalin sham, and he slept there. Kiva shemesh. Why? Because the sun had set. That suggests that he wasn't expecting the sun to set. Something happened. Vayikach mi'avnei hamakom, he took from the stones of the place. Vayasem rashotav, and he made a pillow from it. Vayishkav hamakom, and he lay down there in that place. Just look at that. 3 times we got the word place without being told where it was. Then he has his dream. Look at this dream. Vayachalom, and he dreamed. Vehine, behold, there's a ladder on the ground and its top reached to heaven. And hine, behold, second time, the angels of God were going up and down. What does that mean? Next verse. Vehine, behold, third time, God is standing, nitzav alav, the translation says over him. Some say it means over him, some say it's over the ladder. Either way, he's got the sense of God hovering above. And now God speaks. And he says, Ani Hashem Elokei Avraham Avicha, Elokei Yitzchak. I'm the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Haaretz asher ata shochev alea, lecha etnena lezarecha. The land which you are lying on, I'm going to give to you and your offspring. So far, this is the blessing of Abraham, with which Isaac blessed Jacob at the end of last week's parasha. So it's really nice to hear that reassurance from God, but it's not yet anything new. Let's look at the next one. Your seed to be as dust of the earth, and you will gain strength. That's what Farat Star really means. You'll be strong. Yama v'kema tzafona v'negba, in all different directions. And through you and your offspring, the whole world will be blessed. Now for a fourth time, Vehine, and behold, Anochi imach, I'm with you. And this now is a new aspect of blessing. God has said two things so far. One is the land is his. Number two is going to spread in all directions. That's been said before, and the blessings also. But here, God now says, I'm going to be with you. Just remember, Jacob is frightened. What's going to be? And God said, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to look after you wherever you go. Not only that, I'm going to bring you back to this land. Ki lo ezavcha, I will never forsake you, until that I have done what I said I would do. That's God's message to Jacob. At a terrifying time in his life, he has this incredible message of reassurance. The next morning, well, not the next morning, probably. It's probably still the night. Vaikatz Yaakov Mishnato. Jacob woke up, Vayomer, and he said, Achen yesh Hashem. Indeed, the Lord is here. Look at this again. Ba makom. We had makom placed 3 times earlier. We're going to have it another 3 now. God is in this place. Vanochi lo yadati. And I didn't know. Just look at that phrase. Anochi, I, lo yadati, which means I didn't know. So there's an extra word here, anochi. What can we learn from this? We'll come back to all these things in a while. Vayira vayomar. And he was frightened and he said, Ma nora makom hazeh. How awesome is this place, makom. Ein Zaid has to be Beit Elohim. It's the house of God. The Zeh Shar Shamayim, and this is the gate of heaven. What does he mean by that? He's the first person in the Torah, in Tanakh, to talk about the concept of the house of God. And then, Vayashkem Yaakov Baboke, he got up early in the morning, he took the stone, he placed it at his head, set it up as a monument, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the place Beit El, again, Makom, the place, Beit El, and Luz was the name previously. Why are we being told all this? And finally, we come to Jacob's vow. Vaidar Yaakov neder limod. Jacob took a vow and he said, if God will be with me and guard me on this way upon which I am going, and give me bread to eat and a garment to wear, clothes to wear? And if I return in peace to my father's house, and the Lord will be my God, then this stone which I have placed as a monument shall be a house of God, and everything you shall give me, I will surely tithe to you. The real question here is, what does Jacob mean by if? God has promised him. What's the if? So, let us recap for a moment. The first thing is that he said, that the text tells us hine 4 times, as if to say each stage of the dream matters, each counts. This isn't a dream, and often we have dreams and we may even see some sense in them, but a lot of the time they're things which are really inconsequential. The fact that it keeps saying the word hine, repeating the word hine, behold this, means that each part has significance. What is that significance? How do we understand the dream? How do we understand the repetition of the word makom 3 times, telling us that he came to the place, and then 3 times when he gets up in the morning and talks about the place? What do we understand by the angels going up and down the ladder? What does that mean? What does even the ladder represent? What is the conditional vow? It seems to be conditional. If God does this, then this stone will be altered. How are we supposed to understand that? So let's have a look, first of all, at the ladder. So again, so here we are, verse 12. V'hinei sulam, there is a ladder, mutzav arza. It's standing, that's what it really means, standing on the ground, and its head is in the heavens. Do you know the only other thing in Torah which is mentioned standing on the ground, and the head reaches into the heavens, is of course the Tower of Babel. How different this is and how different the experience is. What is Jacob to take away from this experience? So what I'd like to do, and you'll have to bear with me just for a moment.
Without belittling the achievements.
Well, I had prepared a video to watch, so if you'll just bear with me just for another moment.
Of these great leaders.
Okay, very unfortunately, disappeared from the screen. What I wanted to do was to include a recording from last week's video tribute to Rabbi Sacks, in which Rabbi Shlomo Levine of Southampton Synagogue, in his tribute, he spoke about a bridge. He gave us a metaphor of a bridge with very strong foundations either side. One of them is absolutely strong foundations in Torah. The other one, very strong foundations in secular knowledge. Rabbi Sacks, of course, had both to such an extent that he was able to bring people with a Torah knowledge to walk with him to secular knowledge, and those with secular knowledge to walk across the bridge to picture of Torah knowledge. And that is something which is pretty unique in being able to do. And Rabbi Shlomo Levine really, in his tribute, said he just doesn't know of anyone else who's able to do this to the same extent. So I'd like to suggest that what we have in the ladder is to an extent something similar, different but similar, because the ladder is firmly on the ground, but it's reaching up to the heavens. So on the ground, if you like, is this world, the material needs of this world, reaching up to the heavens, the spiritual. And there are angels going up and down. There can be a connection between the two, and there has to be. And our job as a Jew, and one of the lessons that we take away from Yaakov, from Jacob, our lesson is that we have to bring sanctity to the world. It's not a separation of heaven and earth. There's a ladder linking heaven and earth. Jacob is leaving home now. He's leaving the security, the spirituality of his upbringing to an unknown existence. Let's be honest, we don't know. And how's he going to cope on the spiritual level? And the answer is that God is giving him a message here, a subtle message, that he can bridge the two. But more than that, over and above this message, just to remind ourselves, he is a frightened man. He's left home and he's going off into the unknown. Will he cope? Will he manage? And God gave his reassurance that yes, he will. Not only that, but God will bring him back. One thing I also want to point out is that this parasha, Vayetze, is one paragraph in the Torah. It's 5.5 columns long, and there's not a single paragraph break, which means that all the stories are connected, and we'll see a little bit later how that is so. But let's remind ourselves again, Jacob on the run, and he is frightened. Let's again look at the fact that the ladder is on the ground. And just remember, at this point in our story, so is Jacob. He's lying asleep on the ground. And he is, we wouldn't normally say on the ground, we'd say he's on the floor. He's at a very low point. He's run away from home. Life is really uncertain. What is going to be? And he has the dream of the ladder. And one other way of understanding the angels, and it's brought in Rashi, that the angels of Eretz Israel are leaving him, and the angels of the diaspora outside Israel are accompanying him. One's going up, the other's coming down, and they're going to go with him. And at the very end of the parasha, at the end of 20 years with the Lavan, he comes back to the land. He is met by angels. The reverse operation is happening, except this time it's not in a dream. This time he sees it in broad daylight. And in the middle, in between all of this, he is away with Lavan. The question is, what does actually happen while he's away on this spiritual material challenge that he's going on? The bare bones of the story we're obviously very familiar with. Rabbi Sacks points out on this week's parasha and next week's that Jacob is unique among the patriarchs, that his visions come at night. Two main visions. This is one, the dream, and the other is the wrestle with the angel in next week's parasha. And they're, of course, very different. One, he sees the whole spectacle of the ladder, and the other is a fight. It's a fight. And how do we understand both of them? And in this context, you could say that the ladder, rung by rung, is how we climb up to the heavens. So yes, we're rooted in the material world, but we have to at the same time try and climb that spiritual ladder, step by step, rung by rung. And whenever a rabbi says, take one step at a time in terms of increasing observance, increasing spirituality, this is where he gets it from, the ladder of Jacob. The fight with the angel in next week's parasha is completely different. At times we do have to fight. We hopefully not too often physically, but very often spiritually, fighting ourselves. And at times like that, we sometimes find that we have inner strength that we didn't know we had. And the way Rabbi Sacks puts it as well, Jacob is in crisis. And he has many crises going forward. His life is crises from this point onwards. And each time, somehow or another, he finds the inner strength to grapple with these crises. And Rabbi Sacks points out several other people that known to us. Moses, for example, he had his moments of crises. At one point, Ba'alotecha, he asked to die. Elijah the prophet, also at one point in his service to Hashem, it's too much, he asked to die. Jeremiah, the same thing. Jonah, the same thing. And each time, God gives them the tools to grapple with these crises. So let's for a moment look at the structure, how it plays out in the Sedra, but then I want to go back to the vision itself and the place itself. So we've got here, and I'm grateful for Rav Taragin Yeshivat HaKotel just setting it out in this way. Look at the structure of this parasha. It's like a pyramid. You've got A's, A at the top, A at the bottom, then B's a bit more in, C more so, and D is the middle. It begins and ends in a very similar way. Jacob's running away from Esau, and he encounters in the dream angels. On the way back, he's run away from Lavan back to Esau, and he encounters angels. And then, of course, following the angels, he goes to Lavan. And then towards the end of the Seder, of course, he's running away from Lavan. Then we know he works hard for his wives. And then afterwards, he works hard for wages in the form of sheep. Bang in the middle is the birth of the children, lots of children. And I put here Leah's role. What is the difference between this part, B and C on the one hand, and C and B on the other, the first half of the second half? There is a huge change, and the credit for this change goes to Leah. And it's this. with all the reassurance that God gives Jacob, God's name does not appear again in the first half of the parasha. He's cheated by Lavan, as we know, and he has to work, and it's really unpleasant, and things are very difficult. And he meets, before that, he meets shepherds at the well. There's no mention of God anywhere, as if there's something missing. And there is something missing. And Leah recognizes it before Rachel does. Leah is the one that when Reuven is born, she says, Shama Hashem et oni, God has heard my affliction. The fact that she is the less loved wife. Vayiten li ben, and he's given me a son. And each time a child is born, Leah thanks Hashem. Rachel, on the other hand, at this point, is jealous of her sister. And in her jealousy, she talks. There's no mention of Hashem. And only much later on, when she's been through, Leah's had more children, and the maidservants have had children. Eventually, Rachel, as we say, chapsit, understands that God's role in this is pivotal. And only after that does Jacob now start invoking God, as should have been. So Jacob himself had to grow through the Sedra. So it's not just, the symmetry of the angels at the beginning, the angels at the end. Jacob himself has changed, not just that he came back with a huge family, having gone away empty-handed. He arrived empty-handed at Lavan, and he left with a huge family. It's not just that. We find he's grown as a person. That takes us into next week's Sedra, which is not for now. But let's go back for a moment now to the dream, to the place, and understand a little bit more. So Jacob says about this place, Ma norah hamakom hazeh, how awesome is this place? It's none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Where is he? And of course, he calls the place Beit El. You look on a map today, Beit El, and it's north of Jerusalem, it's in Samaria. But the commentators seem to all agree that whether he was transported to Yerushalayim or Yerushalayim was transported to Beit El, they discuss. But the notion was that he was at Mount Moriah, the place where, according to the Midrash, that's Jerusalem. That's the Temple Mount. That's where Abraham took Yitzchak. And that is also where Yitzchak prayed subsequently. Except Jacob calls it Beit Elohim, the house of God, and it's Shar HaShamayim. What does Shar HaShamayim mean? The gate of heaven. In other words, the place where our prayers ascend. And that's why those of you who've been on the tunnel tours, especially, we're told we're standing in a place which is as close as we can get to the Holy of Holies. This is the place where the prayers ascend heavenwards to this day. So he says, he invokes the name of this place. But look at this. To start with, he says, Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh. 3 times we've got the word makom. Earlier and now here. The Kli Yakar has a fascinating explanation on this, that they refer to the 3 temples. when he says, there is God in this place and I didn't know, how sad is that? The first temple was full of miracles. You apparently sense the divine presence there, the Shekhinah, but people worshipped idols. They worshipped idols. The second temple had none of that. And this second makom in verse 17, Yud Zayin, it says, this can only be the house of God. In other words, it's a temple, but devoid of the miracles of the first temple. There's no sense of divine presence. There's no prophecy. There's no Urim V'Tumim. There are none of these things. None of these things are going on. That's the second temple. And then he says, Vayikra Shem HaMakom Hahu Beit El. That was Beit El. Said, this, in the third temple, everyone will acknowledge this is the house of God. By the way, the second temple, I'm sorry, to go back to the second temple, where he says, can only be the house of God. Ironically, without all those miracles, the second temple was held in greater esteem, greater awe, not just by the Jews, but by the surrounding non-Jews as well. And then the third temple, Shem HaMakom Hahu Beit El, the house of God, and Luz was the name beforehand. You know, this idea of the Luz bone, when a person dies, that's the only thing left through decomposure. So there was nothing left of the second temple. It's all been, plowed over. But in the future, we'll have no doubt this is the house of God. Let's now just scroll back to the earlier part, where we have the Makom 3 times. And also he says this is a reference to the first temple, the first one. Why did he come to this place? Because the sun had set. The sun set early on the first temple. It was not up for as long as it was designated to be. Various reasons why that was so, which we won't go into now, but that references the first temple. The second temple was built from some of the stones of the first. And we, those of us who are lucky enough to be on a tour in City of David, have quite a strong explanation of all that. Me Avnei HaMakom. The Kli Yakar says, what stones were not included in the second temple? Well, actually, the stones of the 10 Commandments, because you don't know what happened to the ark. And in the same verse, it says, and Jacob lay down in that place. Unlike the first 2 temples, the third temple will be a time of total peace in the land. We'll be able to lay down at night without being worried about being attacked and all these different things. So it's very powerful imagery. Not only is he getting reassurance for his time away, but he's also told that the future of this very place will be full of grandeur, the temple. There's, however, two more things that we haven't yet looked at, which I wanted to tackle. And here we are. In verse 14, it says, your seed will be as the dust of the earth, and you'll gain strength, west, east, north, south. And through you will be blessed all the families of the earth, and through your seed. Well, there's a startling comment by the Italian commentator, the Sforno, that says, your seed will be dust of the earth. What does that mean? It's not a happy thing. Downtrodden. As people walk on the dust, they'll walk on you. And when you're in your lowest point, suddenly you will gain strength and rise upwards in all directions. And why would this be so? And the Kli Yakar points out that we need at times to get to the lowest point to understand that solution's not going to be with this politician or that politician. Don't put your trust in others. Obviously, work with them and so on. But ultimately, the faith has to be in God. Jacob learned that with Lavan. And when towards the end of the Sedra, he understands that only in God can he trust, we find this word, ufaratzta, represented. Again, it says, Vaifrot sa'ish, then Jacob became strong. Do you know who we find this with as well? Joseph. Joseph reached absolute rock bottom, 12 years in jail. Only by then did he really understand salvation would not come, certainly not from the butler, but only from Hashem. And he rose from being, one day, from being a slave, virtually forgotten, from being a prisoner, virtually forgotten, to being Viceroy of Egypt. And in the future redemption, we could be at a terrible low and then reach an incredible high. And it's impossible, for me, it's impossible not to think of the Holocaust and the state of Israel, which the Holocaust was just so terrible. And the state of Israel, 3 years later, just almost unbelievable. So Jacob's dream, the circumstances of the place, and the fact that he was looked after by God, incredible messages of reassurance. But then he said, if God looks after me and he returns me to my father's house, then I will come back to this place and pour oil all over again, which is what he did in next week's parasha. But why the sense of if? And again, we turn to the Kli Yakar and he says, Jacob was worried. He was worried that he would get ensnared by other societies and gradually he would lose his connection to God, to spirituality, what we would call Judaism today. He was worried about that. And if that were to happen, he wouldn't merit God's promise of being brought back. And by the way, in this, he had a lot in common with his father and grandfather. They relied on God's promises only to the extent that they themselves will keep free from sin. But because they couldn't guarantee that, they had doubts of God's promises. They weren't doubting God, they were doubting themselves. And that is the point. And that's why he said, V'shati b'shalom el beit avi, that I should return in peace to my father's house. And Rashi comments on that. Shalom means peace, but it also means perfect. In other words, untainted by the various societies in which he would come across. And they were various, not just Lavan, but on the way home, he had the whole business with Shechem, which is also next week's parasha, but he did return intact to his father's house. And with that, he was able to fulfill his vow, which he took in this week's Sedra, and we see the fulfillment of that vow in next week's Sedra. So I'd like to conclude with some words of Rabbi Sacks, who really, to me, sums up this whole portion with regard to the dream, the ladder, and so on. Number one, at a time when we feel most alone, Hashem is with us. Number two, we should see faith as a ladder, which we can climb one at a time. And at times, in difficult times, we will reveal within ourselves strength that we didn't know we had. From Jacob we learn the courage to hope and the strength to dream.